Settle in and let your breath soften as we gently step into the past. The world outside your window is quiet, now electric lights flicker, digital sounds hum softly, and everything feels just a little more still. But tonight, we're going to wander into another kind of evening, one that smells of smoke, roasts, and mud, one filled with the murmur of haggling voices, the clatter of wooden wheels, and the steady shuffle of weary feet. Imagine yourself on the uneven cobblestones of a medieval town, wrapped in the dull grey shawl of morning fog. The year could be 1320, or perhaps 1475. It matters little. What matters is that we are stepping into the life of someone overlooked in grand chronicles of kings and battles. We are here to follow the quiet, difficult and surprisingly intricate world of the medieval street vendor. Their days were long, their margins thin, their roles essential. They sold cabbages, scraps of cloth, eel pies, or pots. Their world was messy, mundane, and extraordinarily alive. Let's begin by immersing ourselves in a day in their life, from the first stirring of the town to the final coin, dropped into a cloth pouch before dusk settles in again. Close your eyes if you like, breathe deeply, and let's begin. The sun is only a pale suggestion behind low, sullen clouds. Its rays do not burst forth, but seep quietly into the mist that hangs between the leaning buildings. Roosters crow here and there, though their calls are often drowned by the groan of wooden shutters and the slap of buckets against water barrels. A street vendor stirs in a cramped loft above a smithy or beneath the sloped roof of a shared hovel. Their sleeping mat is straw-stuffed and damp. No chimney warms this room. Instead, the chill of dawn lingers, pressing against the bones. Clothing is minimal, perhaps just 2 tunics to their name. One worn threadbare, the other just slightly better, saved for feast days or the rare occasion of parish festival. Without ceremony, they rise. There is no breakfast, not in the way we know it. A chunk of yesterday's bread, softened in watered-down ale, is enough to give energy for the first steps outside. The door opens to a lane of packed earth, trampled refuse, and puddles that haven't dried in weeks. They push their handcart or balance a tray across their shoulders. Goods vary: turnips gathered from a nearby farm, pies baked overnight and wrapped in cloth to stay warm, or simple trinkets like carved buttons and bits of dyed ribbon. Each item has its own small story, harvested in haste, bartered with a neighbour, or crafted under moonlight when the day's trading ended. The vendor walks quickly. Prime space near the market square is scarce, and competition is fierce. Although the town has a designated market day, usually once or twice a week, the surrounding days are still filled with informal trade. Near the cathedral gates, the baker's alley, or along the lanes that lead to the river docks, these places pulse with haphazard commerce. By the time church bells mark the 3rd hour after sunrise, the streets are filling with life. Apprentices shout to one another as they haul barrels. Housewives pass, bargaining hard. Dogs lope between legs. Children tug at skirts in search of sweets, while constables watch with narrowed eyes for any hint of unlicensed trade. For the vendor, this is where the rhythm begins. Stand, shout, smile, repeat. Their voice must cut through noise without becoming harsh. Their posture must be welcoming, but never too idle. A cart left unattended risks being robbed. A tray held at the wrong angle might tip, ruining both product and profit. The weather shapes everything. In winter, breath clouds in front of faces, and fingers go stiff while handling coins. In summer, the smell of food and sweat clings to the skin and draws flies in droves. Rain is both curse and necessity. It drives customers away but settles the dust. The coins they earn are few and mostly copper, pennies and farthings, perhaps a halfpenny if the buyer is generous or in a rush. Most of what is sold yields a margin so thin, one spoiled apple or squashed pie can ruin the day's income. And yet, without these vendors, towns would starve between harvests and feast days. Their presence is as steady as the tolling of bells. By midday, their stomachs ache. Few can afford to eat what they sell. A shared pot of pottage with a fellow vendor may be their only warm meal. More often, a cup of weak ale and a crust will suffice. Rest is stolen in moments leaning against a wall, closing the eyes for a breath's worth of peace. They endure insults from the wealthy, taxes from guild enforcers, and suspicion from constables who view all street traders as little better than vagrants. A license might be demanded, a bribe expected, a place forcibly cleared by an official with the wave of a baton and no explanation. And yet, they return each day. Their feet blister, their voices fray, their backs bend. But through it all, they carry not only goods, but the lifeblood of the town, those everyday items that link farm to table, maker to user, and one human to another. When you next sip your tea or walk through a quiet square, think of them, those anonymous figures who opened their stall in the dark and hoped not for riches but for enough to last until tomorrow. Now that we have settled into the rhythm of a vendor's morning, let us pause and look beyond the wares they carry. For each cracked tray or battered cart tells only part of the story. Behind the apron, beneath the soot-lined fingernails and weathered faces, are lives with histories, quiet biographies that seldom make it into books or songs. Imagine a woman named Alice. She is not young, but her age is difficult to guess. Years in the open air have etched fine lines around her eyes, not from laughter but from squinting into smoke and sun. Her parents were villains tied to the land, working under a local lord's harsh demands. But in her youth, she walked away, not as an act of rebellion, but of survival. After a bad harvest and the death of her younger brother to fever, there was nothing left to hold her in the village. She arrived at the town gates with little more than a bundle of rags and a memory of how her mother had baked root pies. Over time, she found her way into the alleys behind the baker's quarter. She slept beneath a tanner's shed for months, but she watched, she learned, and eventually she bartered for flour and began baking small, savoury pies of onion and oat, wrapped in clean scraps of cloth. She sold them near the smithy where labourers gathered before the midday toll. The pies were plain, but warm and filling, and slowly her name began to mean something to hungry mouths. Or consider Thomas, once an apprentice cooper. His master died of a sudden swelling fever, and the guild would not admit Thomas on his own. With no tools and no trade, he turned to what he knew, making use of cast-offs. He wandered the docks and butcher's lane, collecting bones, broken handles, and odd bits of metal. His cart was a chaos of odds and ends fixable tools, second-hand boots, pots with holes. He fixed what he could, polished what he couldn't, and sold to those who could not afford the new. Thomas was never invited to feast days, but many depended on him. The blacksmith's wife once said that Thomas had saved more kitchens with a hammered-out pot bottom than the priest had with his sermons. These vendors were rarely alone. Many worked in family groups, their children darting between legs, shouting prices in shrill voices that reached farther than any adult could manage. A husband might bake while the wife sold, or vice versa. Older children often helped keep accounts taut not to read, but to count, and to feel the difference in weight between a penny and a clipped coin. There were also those who lived alone, widows, orphaned boys, unmarried women all, found a kind of invisible refuge in the anonymity of the market. Among vendors, reputation mattered more than heritage. It was not where you came from, but whether your cheese was clean and your cabbage fresh that shaped your welcome. Some vendors had side trades, patching shoes, singing simple rhymes, sharpening knives. A few had once been soldiers, walking with a limp and a distant stare, now selling firewood or salted fish. One man, it was said, had fought in France and now carved wooden spoons by the dozen, humming a chant from a land no one remembered. Their lives were punctuated by small milestones, an especially profitable day after a festival, or the rare chance to rent a stall in the covered market for winter months. Illness was a constant threat. A cough that lingered could mean ruin. There were no doctors for people like them, only old women with bundles of herbs and whispered prayers. And yet they persevered. These were not saints or heroes. They could be sharp-tongued, stubborn, or petty, But they carried something quietly admirable, the determination to wake, to walk, to sell, and to sleep day after day for no glory, no reward, other than survival. Next time you think of history, try not to picture only the throne or the battlefield. Picture instead the thin woman with the handcart, or the boy shouting prices for turnips. They too were history. They shaped the breath and pulse of a medieval town and coin, one step, one day at a time. As the days passed and years folded over one another, the places where medieval vendors worked became as much a part of their identity as the goods they sold. A vendor did not simply appear at random. Each town had its own quiet geography of commerce, shaped by centuries of footsteps, laws, and unspoken understandings. Let us imagine the town as a living organism, its centre pulsing with trade and sound, its limbs branching out into quieter lanes and alleys. The heart of this organism was the market square, or simply the market, though it was rarely a tidy place. Cobblestones were worn smooth, and often slick with refuse. Wooden stalls crowded together, canopies flapping, goods displayed on tables, crates, or nothing at all. It was where butchers carved meat in the open air, where fishmongers sloshed through pails of water, where the spice seller's cloth sack held small treasures too expensive for most to touch. Yet most vendors could not afford a stall in this prime space. Instead, they found corners and cracks in the urban sprawl, wedging themselves between a tannery wall and the stables, or setting up beside a public well where foot traffic was heavy. Some worked near church doors, hoping to catch the faithful as they exited. Others claimed patches of road outside the town gate, offering goods to travellers and carts before they ever reached the official market. Each space held its own rules. To sell near the Guildhall required a license. To sell by the river meant dealing with customs collectors or local toll-keepers. Some areas were controlled by the town council, others by religious houses who taxed the vendors and sometimes offered shelter, but rarely both. There was a rhythm to where certain items appeared. Fresh vegetables might be laid out along the southern edge of the market, where the sun hit longest. Sellers of fabric and ribbon preferred the east wall, where light made their colours shimmer in the morning. The western edge was rougher, often reserved for second-hand tools, bones, or bits of scrap. And then there was the periphery, where the truly poor set up those without permits, selling wilted greens or wilted fortunes, depending on the day. The streets themselves spoke in texture. Some were packed dirt, fine and dusty in summer, ankle-deep with mud in the spring. Others were paved with uneven stones, worn by countless hoofbeats and heavy carts. Every vendor knew the danger of a poor pitch choose, a spot where the slope was wrong, and rain would ruin the goods. Choose a spot near the tanneries, and customers might not stay long due to the unbearable stench. Weather changed everything. Wind might knock over a display, scatter feathers, or flip a pie face down into the gutter. Rain forced vendors to huddle under makeshift tarps or the eaves of sympathetic shopkeepers. Snow was rare, but deadly, not only freezing hands and feet, but keeping customers indoors. On those days, vendors walked through the town like shadows, calling their wares in softer tones, hoping for a housewife's glance from behind a shutter. Public spaces were not just commercial, they were also performative. To sell well was to read a crowd. A vendor needed to know when to shout, when to whisper, and when to say nothing at all. Some displayed their goods with theatrical flair, tossing apples into the air or slicing open a cheese round to let the scent do the talking. Others relied on reputation alone, return customers who came each week for that one reliable sausage or that one well-mended pot. Of course, there were risks. In the crowded lanes, accidents were common. A runaway cart could crush a stall. Fights broke out between rivals over placement, pricing, or rumours of stolen goods. Constables enforced order with uneven hands, often ignoring wealthier sellers while targeting the poorest for harassment or fines. But amid the noise and jostling, there was also kinship. Vendors watched one another's carts when someone had to step away. News spread along the market paths faster than through official proclamations. A birth, a death, or a good catch of fish upriver could be known across the town by midday simply through quiet murmurs among sellers. There were rituals too, blessings on feast days, shared bread on winter mornings, a secret coin slipped into a basket for a vendor who had fallen ill. The geography of trade was also the geography of care rooted not only in profit, but in presence, endurance, and shared survival. The town changed over time, walls expanded, roads were widened, buildings rebuilt. But the market remained, not in its form but in its spirit. The corners where lives were traded, one apple, one ribbon, one spoon at a time they lingered. Even long after the vendors were gone, their footsteps remained faintly pressed into the earth. By now, you have wandered through the busy lanes of medieval markets, heard the cries of vendors echo between stone walls, and perhaps felt the rhythm of their footsteps beneath your imagination. But to truly understand their world, one must turn toward the invisible lines of power, those drawn not by rope or chalk, but by rules, fines, and guild charters. Medieval towns did not thrive on freedom. Rather, they pulsed with regulation, especially when it came to trade. And the most powerful enforcers of that regulation were the craft and merchant guilds. Guilds, in their essence, were professional associations, but they were far more than a collective of workers. A guild was part trade union, part fraternity, part government agency, and part gatekeeper. It regulated who could sell what, where, and how. It trained apprentices, oversaw standards, and, most crucially for street vendors, controlled access to legitimate trade. Imagine a town where the Bakers' Guild declared that only those trained and approved by their ranks could sell bread within the market. A woman who baked pies on her hearthstone and sold them from a tray might, to the guild, be an interloper, a competitor, operating outside their hierarchy, undercutting prices, and refusing to pay dues. The punishment? Confiscation of goods, public humiliation, or fines that could ruin her entirely. For vendors, navigating this world was like treading water with weights tied to their ankles. Some held charters-thin slips of parchment purchased at cost, granting permission to trade in a specific good within a specific street. Others relied on verbal agreements with town bailiffs or older guild members, though these arrangements could be revoked without warning. The rules were not always written, nor were they consistent. A pot seller might be tolerated on a side street one week, then chased off the next for encroaching on a metalworker's territory. A cheese vendor could find herself suddenly subject to inspection for quality, while the wealthier merchant down the road passed unchallenged. Vendors who resisted control faced not just penalties but the full social weight of exclusion. They might be labelled foreigners, even if they had lived in the town for years, or accused of dishonest weights and measures. A street vendor's scale, often nothing more than a handheld balance, was scrutinized far more closely than the gleaming brass scales behind a gilded stall. Yet many found quiet ways to exist within the cracks. Some joined guilds in name only, paying the lowest tier of dues for minimal protection. Others formed informal networks, a group of vendors who sold different goods but shared information and watched one another's backs. There were even guild members who looked the other way, or who quietly favored certain vendors out of respect, friendship, or personal profit. One example often repeated in town records is of a man named Bertrand, a cobbler who never joined the guild but repaired shoes beneath the eaves of the chapel gate for nearly 20 years. Officially, he was breaking every rule, but his prices were fair, his work reliable, and he knew the guards by name. No one bothered him until one spring. A new guild warden was elected, and Bertrand was dragged before the council for habitual disrespect of market order. His punishment? A fine so steep he vanished for weeks. Yet by midsummer, he returned, quietly working again, this time 2 streets over, in the shadow of the grain hall. Such was the balance: obedience and resistance, punishment and persistence. The relationship between vendors and guilds was not always adversarial. There were towns where guilds provided aid to poor traders, particularly in times of famine or plague. Some guilds set aside space in the covered market for unaffiliated vendors during holy festivals, allowing them a rare chance to sell without fear. But these moments were exceptions. More often, street vendors lived at the legal edge, constantly shifting their position, their prices, their language, to stay just beneath the threshold of punishment. They developed a quiet fluency in reading moods, reading rules, and reading loopholes. To be a vendor in such a world was to be endlessly adaptable. Today, a seller of apples. Tomorrow, a dealer in cracked pottery. The next day, singing ballads for coin if the rain ruined both. Identity was fluid, trade was seasonal, and legality was a moving target. The guilds remained, thick with parchment and pride. Their ledgers recorded the names of masters and apprentices. Their minutes logged the fines against illegal hawkers, and their halls echoed with the sound of policy. But outside, in the shifting light of dawn, the vendors continued cart by cart, step by step, law by law. They knew the game, and they knew how to survive it. Amid the daily struggles of life on the street, amid the damp mornings, the guild tensions, and the constant barter, there were moments that shimmered with a different kind of energy. Feast days, holy festivals, the great market fairs that arrived like a pageant, stirring even the quietest alleys into motion. For vendors, these occasions were a paradox, both blessing and burden. They brought crowds, noise, and rare opportunities. But they also came with new rules, fierce competition, and the gaze of authorities more watchful than ever. Imagine the transformation of a town on the eve of St. Martin's Day. The air is crisp, and coloured banners hang from timbered windows. Bells ring more brightly. Smoke from roasting meat mingles with the scent of beeswax candles and damp moss underfoot. Even the poorest wear their slightly better tunic, and for a brief moment, the usual hierarchy softens. Children laugh openly. Apprentices linger near fountains. Even the town constable may crack a tired smile. The street vendor sees the change and acts quickly. Many began preparing weeks before. Potters shaped extra jugs and bowls. Bakers made dried fruit pasties, meant to last through travel. Women embroidered simple handkerchiefs with bright threads. Some gathered herbs and berries, dried them into sachets for sale, as remedies or perfumed keepsakes. Fairs and feast markets attracted not only locals, but traders from distant towns, pilgrims, clergy, and visiting nobles. It was a time of mingling accents and mixed currencies. The street filled with stalls that hadn't existed the day before. New faces, unfamiliar tricks, and sometimes better goods. It was, in many ways, a temporary chaos of economy. Rules varied widely depending on the town's customs and who held the rights to the fair. In some places, the local lord or abbey controlled the market grounds and issued special tokens or paper permits for the duration of the fair. These were often expensive and in short supply. In others, the town council relaxed restrictions, allowing unlicensed vendors to trade freely within designated lanes. For the poorest vendors, this was a rare window and invitation, however fragile, into legitimacy. They set up their wares on cloths over cobblestones, shouting louder than usual, sometimes even offering samples. A vendor who usually sold onions might bake them into small tarts and rebrand them as festival fare. A boy with a bundle of switches might suddenly sell them as good luck charms to ward off winter spirits. The atmosphere was one of theatre. Musicians played pipes and fiddles, dancers moved in circles, and jesters performed small tricks for coin. Street preachers offered fiery warnings, while sellers of indulgences hawked paper absolution. It was a tangle of sacred and profane, of joy and survival. But competition was sharp. More sellers meant thinner profits. Prices fluctuated wildly. One moment, a pie might fetch 2 pennies. An hour later, it might go unsold. And with more vendors came more eyes watching, guilds protecting their turf, constables enforcing curfews, and pickpockets watching for distracted hands. Still, for many, it was worth the risk. A good fare could provide coin enough to mend a roof, buy a blanket, or pay off a fine. It might mean a rare treat, a bit of dried meat, a cup of warm cider, a simple wooden toy for a child. More than that, it meant visibility, a chance to be seen, to trade not just goods but goodwill, to remind customers and competitors alike, I am here, I exist. There were also shared moments. At the close of certain feast days, vendors sometimes pooled unsold goods and offered them to the parish poor, not from charity alone, but from tradition, from belief, and from the quiet understanding that fortune was fickle. Today's seller might be tomorrow's beggar. When the final bell rang and the crowd began to thin, vendors packed up slowly, not just from weariness, but from the quiet ache of returning to normal. The magic of the fair faded quickly, leaving behind only footprints, scattered straw, and half-forgotten melodies. The next morning they would return to their usual corners. The pie would lose its fig garnish. The cloth would be folded back into its bundle. But something lingered, a memory, perhaps, of having stood in the light, if only briefly. For those who lived at the edges of town and society, such moments were more than in the bustling lanes of medieval towns, amid the carts and cries, the sharp scents and stony paths. One could easily overlook a quiet truth. Women were everywhere, not just in the shadows of household doors or beneath veils in the church nave, but squarely in the heart of the market, buying, selling, bargaining, and surviving. Women in the medieval marketplace were not simply companions to their husbands' businesses. Many were independent vendors in their own right, navigating the same risks, expectations, and opportunities as their male counterparts, and often doing so while carrying children, enduring scrutiny, and balancing domestic demands at the same time. Imagine a woman named Isabel. She rises before the town stirs, her hands red from cold water as she scrubs the morning's washing. Beside the hearth, a child sleeps wrapped in layers of worn cloth. With the bread set to bake, she readies her goods for the market. Bundles of herbs gathered from the hedgerow, dyed threads wound tightly into skeins, and a basket of eggs carefully padded with hay. Her husband is gone lost to war, to illness, or perhaps never present at all. Yet she walks with purpose, tray in hand, weaving through the streets toward her usual patch by the cooper's yard. For women like Isabel, the market offered a kind of independence, rarely found elsewhere. Though the broader medieval world was deeply patriarchal, with strict norms about property, obedience, and labor, the marketplace was an in-between, spaceless, formal, more fluid. It rewarded sharp wits, good memory, and personal relationships. Many women sold produce from family plots, dairy from their own goats, or cloth they had spun themselves. Others baked, brewed ale, sold candles, or made rushlights dipped in fat. Some peddled second-hand goods, simple medicines, or charms written on scraps of parchment. A few, particularly older widows, operated as moneylenders or facilitators, keeping small ledgers in their heads, balancing favors with quiet interest. Not all were welcomed. Guilds frequently barred women from full membership, especially in trades considered prestigious or physically demanding. Yet women worked within those trades regardless, as helpers, assistants, or unofficial partners. A butcher's wife might handle customers while her husband carved. A carpenter's daughter might mend wooden stools as quickly and skillfully as any journeyman. Still, the credit often went elsewhere. In some towns, single or widowed women could become femme sole, under law, meaning they had the right to trade, own property, and represent themselves. This status was rare and not easily won, but for those who held it, it opened remarkable freedom. Even for those without legal status, power could be found in familiarity. A woman who had sold greens for 20 years might know every midwife, washerwoman, and steward in the town. Her knowledge of who needed what and when gave her leverage that no paper license could offer. These women were traders, yes, but also weavers of the social fabric. They heard the gossip, they observed the patterns, They sensed when grain would be scarce, or when a marriage might change alliances within the neighborhood. Many served as informal matchmakers, messengers, and healers. If someone fell ill, the market women knew before the priest did. Their presence, though often uncelebrated, shaped the tone of the streets. They argued prices without apology. They settled disputes. They corrected weights. And when a constable tried to impose an unfair toll, it was often the women who rallied, loudly and publicly, forcing him to reconsider or retreat. Yet their strength came at a cost. They were targets of suspicion, particularly if they succeeded. A woman who grew too prosperous might be accused of dishonesty, of using unnatural means, or worse, whispers of witchcraft were never far from those who challenged societal norms. The line between respected vendor and feared outsider was thin, and it shifted with the season. Still, they endured. You might not find their names in the charters, or the painted windows of guild halls, but their hands stirred the pots, counted the coins, raised the sons and daughters who became the next generation of craftsmen and clerks. Their feet pressed the earth, day after day, shaping the market not only as a space of exchange, but as a living, breathing extension of their strength and care. So when you picture the medieval marketplace, do not imagine only grey-bearded men and shouting boys. Picture, instead, the woman with a crooked smile, herbs bundled at her hip, and stories behind her eyes. Picture the quiet might of a grandmother counting coins with perfect precision. Picture the unrecorded power of those who carried the world in baskets on their backs and kept it going. Indulgence. They were renewal. Step back now from the bustle of any single day and widen the lens. A street vendor's life was not measured only in hours and coins, but in seasons, those slow-turning arcs of sun and frost that shaped everything from goods to customers, and from price to pace. The medieval year moved in a rhythm, unlike our own. It began not in January, but often in spring, when warmth returned to the soil and hunger loosened its grip. For vendors, spring was both renewal and anxiety. After the lean months of winter, many had little to sell and fewer reserves to fall back on. Food stocks were low, debts had piled up, and the roads still muddy with thaw were slow to carry fresh goods. In spring, you might see a vendor with wild garlic, nettles, or young radishes, each sold not for profit but for the promise of starting again. Cloth sellers brought out whatever bolts they'd stored over winter, hoping brighter light would make their wares more appealing. Alewives resumed brewing with fresher grain, though early spring batches were notoriously weak. Summer was the season of opportunity. The sun dried the lanes and brought travellers. Markets swelled. Herbs were fresh. Fruits ripened, and livestock fairs hummed with movement. A vendor might carry baskets of cherries or gooseberries, jars of curdled milk wrapped in damp cloth to keep cool. It was also a time of labour-long hours, heavy lifting, and the ever-present challenge of spoilage. Imagine a hot day in late June. The vendor wipes sweat from their brow as flies gather thick near the fish cellar. Bread spoils faster now. The risk of foodborne illness rises, and yet the streets are alive. Minstrels pass through. Pilgrims arrive, sunburned and dusty. If the vendor is lucky, there may be a noble party in town, and their servants might come seeking bulk orders of fruit, buttons, or candles. But as midsummer fades, thoughts turn to preparation. Autumn was a time of calculation. How much could be earned and stored before the cold returned? Grain prices rose. Dried beans, onions, and salted meats became the mainstay. Vendors adapted. A seller of herbs might shift to dried garlands or medicinal bundles. A potter might make more lidded jars, suited for preserving. The first cold rains washed down the gutters and reminded everyone winter was not far behind. And winter was survival. The market thinned. Only the most necessary goods remained. Firewood, salted fish, coarse bread. Many vendors disappeared for weak sheltering in poor lodgings, relying on networks of family or charity. Those who stayed bundled themselves in layers and moved less, conserving warmth. Carts were fewer, Trays grew lighter. A candle seller might huddle near a church wall, hoping that the season's holy days would bring in worshippers needing light. The alewife might brew heavier, spiced batches to draw in labourers from the cold. Food sellers leaned into heartier, fair hot porridge, thick pasties, boiled roots. Frost bit at fingers. Slush seeped into boots. Yet even here, the trade did not die. And with the arrival of spring once more slow, subtle, and quiet, the cycle began anew. This rhythm of scarcity and abundance shaped more than trade. It taught resilience. A vendor knew to stretch profit in summer, to preserve and dry goods while they lasted. They learned which roads flooded in spring, which spots were warmest in winter, and which buyers might still be generous after Michaelmas. They marked their time by feast days and saints' days, Lady Day, Eastertide, Lammas, All Hallows. Each brought with it changes in appetite, changes in law, changes in chance. The vendor's year was not a calendar, but a weathered path walked over and over, changing slightly with each cycle. No 2 years were the same. A plague might empty the streets. A war might clog them with refugees. A poor harvest might shift diets entirely. But still, the vendor returned, year after year, with goods in hand and hope tucked quietly beside them. There is a kind of peace in such cycles, a quiet knowing that after cold comes warmth, after loss, the chance to begin again. And so the vendor endures. Though vendors shaped the lifeblood of the medieval town, their place within it remained precarious, always present, always essential, yet seldom trusted. To be a vendor was to stand not only in the marketplace, but often at the blurred edge of legality, where necessity danced uneasily with suspicion. For the well-established merchant behind the oak counter, legitimacy was granted by charters and guild seals. But the street vendor, with her bundle of wares tied in faded cloth, or his cart patched together from discarded timber, existed in a space where every transaction might be questioned. Towns were wary of disorder, and the unsupervised bustle of the street bred unease. Where there was trade, there was talk. And where there was talk, there were rumours, some grounded in fact, others shaped by fear or envy. Accusations flowed easily. A vendor who consistently undercut prices might be accused of theft. Perhaps the apples weren't harvested, but taken from the Lord's orchard by night. A woman selling herbs too effectively might draw whispers of witchery, her knowledge of plants mistaken for spells. A man offering shoes at too great a bargain might face scrutiny for handling stolen goods. Such charges, once spoken aloud, were difficult to shake. There were also real dangers. Petty crime hovered in the narrow lanes and unlit corners of any medieval town. Theft was common, both committed by and against vendors. A moment's distraction could mean a missing coin pouch, a pie snatched by a passing child, or a cart wheeled off while the seller begged for relief from the cold. Some vendors engaged in dishonest practice, tampering with weights, watering ale, disguising spoiled meat beneath heavy spices. It was a fragile balance. For most, these were not acts of malice, but of desperation. The margins were thin. A few extra pennies might mean the difference between rent paid and sleeping outside. Town councils tried to impose order. There were fines for unlicensed trade, regulations on food quality, bans on nighttime selling. Constables walked the lanes with short clubs and long memories, but enforcement was uneven. A wealthy merchant might bribe their way out of a citation. A poor vendor, caught with stale bread, might be pilloried in the square, or have their goods destroyed on the spot. Justice was not always cruel, but it was seldom fair. Still, vendors found ways to navigate the shadows. Some worked in pairs, watching each other's goods and reputations. Others forged quiet understandings with officials' favours traded, warnings whispered, a small pie given in place of a tax. The line between honesty and survival blurred constantly, shifting with the wind and the needs of the day. In times of crisis, the marketplace became even more unstable. During famines or plague outbreaks, restrictions tightened. Sellers might be barred entirely. accused of spreading sickness or exploiting need. Those who remained risked both disease and blame. If someone fell ill after eating a meat pie, the vendor's name might be cursed for weeks fairly or not. Yet there was a strange kind of community, even here. Vendors watched for one another. If a child disappeared, the market knew before the town criers did. If a constable grew too greedy with fines, word spread. If a customer became violent, a quiet wall of solidarity could form nothing dramatic. Just a few carts shifted subtly to block his return. Crime and punishment hovered over their lives, but they were not defined by them. Rather, they existed within the limits imposed by need, by hunger, by the stubborn desire to make it through another week. And sometimes, in quiet acts of defiance, vendors claimed a dignity that no law could take. They laughed. They helped. They shared what little they had. They told stories of clever trades, of miraculous sales, of a morning when the sun rose just right, and the town smiled back. Even in shadow, humanity persists. Now, as the market sounds fade, and the lanterns along the crooked lanes flicker into silence, let us step gently away from the world of the medieval street vendor. Their carts are folded, their voices quiet. Beneath low eaves and behind shuttered doors, they rest, feet aching, backs sore, minds calculating tomorrow's chances. The town sleeps, and yet their presence lingers. Not in statues or stained glass, not in royal charters or velvet-bound chronicles, but in the subtle pulse of history, in the daily rhythms that still echo faintly in our own, the hum of a crowded street, the sight of a stallholder arranging wares with care, the warmth of a simple exchange, wordless but understood. These vendors, so often unnamed, so often unseen, carried the world on their shoulders. They fed the hungry between harvests. They kept goods moving when systems failed. They passed knowledge hand to hand, coin to coin, child to child. They lived hard lives, but not hopeless ones. There was laughter between the cracks of hardship. There was song. There were shared meals, small kindnesses, moments of grace. A scarf given to a cold child, a slice of bread slipped to a beggar, a prayer murmured before dawn. And now, centuries later, they are not truly gone. For in remembering famine, imagining their days, their challenges, their choices, we honor more than history. We honor the countless quiet lives that built the world we know. Not with declarations, but with daily perseverance, with scraped hands, with worn shoes, with stubborn hope. As you lie back now, perhaps letting sleep begin to wrap itself gently around your thoughts, remember this: the past is not always written in grand battles or glittering halls. Sometimes it is found in the soot-smudged corner of a market square, in the quiet footfall of someone selling apples by candlelight, in the rise and fall of voices at the break of day, and in those echoes we find not just history but humanity. Good night, traveller of time. May your rest be peaceful, and your dreams filled with lantern-lit streets and warm bread in unfamiliar hands. Sleep well,